Okay, what we're going to learn about now is how to use parentheses and brackets. Because as soon as these statements start getting a little more complicated, as soon as we start putting things together in logically interesting ways, it becomes necessary to group things using parentheses and brackets. So let me give you an example of what things look like if we didn't have parentheses and brackets. Okay, remember back in high school when you saw something like this, 2 times 3 plus 4. Okay, if you didn't know which of these two things to do first, you wouldn't know what this meant, right? So if you had no idea whether or not to think of it as 2 times 3 plus 4 or 2 times 3 plus 4, you wouldn't know what this meant, right? If it's 2 times 3 plus 4, that's 6 plus 4. This equals 10. If it's 2 times 3 plus 4, that's 2 times 7. That's 14, right? So this statement means different things depending on how we group. Okay, take a look at this logical statement now. Let's let L mean logic. Let's say M means math and B means basket weaving, okay? And you're told when you're registering at Sacred Heart, okay, that you have to take logic and you have to take math or you have to take basket weaving. All right, well, depending on how we group these things, that's going to make a pretty big difference, right? Because if we said you have to take logic and math or basket weaving, you might be tempted to take basket weaving because it'd be easier. But if we said you had to take logic and math or basket weaving, okay, well, what does that mean? That means there's no getting out of taking logic, right? So, in other words, we use parentheses to clarify these complicated statements because without them, we don't know what they mean, okay? And if you think about it, it's the sort of thing we do all the time. So here's an example. If you can lend me money, or I get paid, then I'll go out Friday. If you can lend me money, or I get paid, then I'll go out Friday. What are we saying here? We're saying if one of these two things is the case, then you'll be able to go out Friday. Right? So we're going to need parentheses to express this relationship, right? If you can lend me money or I get paid, then I'll go out Friday. Well, where do you think the parentheses go here? What are we trying to say? We're trying to say if one of these two things is the case, then I'll go out Friday. In other words, we need the parentheses to be able to explain that if either of these things is true, then I'll go out Friday. Let's look at another example. You can have soup or salad, but not soup and salad. Okay, so let's say your waitress at Applebee's tells you that you can have soup or salad, but not soup and salad. Okay, logically speaking now, this is actually becoming fairly complicated. We need to be able to express this. Well, soup or salad, that's easy enough, right? Let's use S for soup. Let's use D for salad. And your waitress is telling you that you can have soup or salad, right? But your waitress is also telling you something else. So we have an and here. We have this, and we're also being told that you can't have soup and salad, right? You can't have them both. So it's not the case that you can have both soup and salad, right? You can see how it becomes necessary pretty quickly to use parentheses to make sense out of ordinary logical relationships. Let's take a look at one more. It's not the case that if you score a 60 or a 70, you get an A. It's not the case that if you score a 60 or a 70, you get an A. Okay, how are we going to say all that? All right, well, we're negating, right? It's not the case that all this is true. Let's figure out what we're negating. We're negating if you score a 60 or a 70, you get an A. Okay, so I'll use S for 60. Okay, I'll use V for 70. Okay, and what we're saying is that if you score a 60 or a 70, then you get an A, right? Now notice, what we're trying to say though is that this whole thing is untrue, right? This is not the case. This whole big relationship here is not the case, or this set of relationships is not the case. How are we going to do that? We need something else. We need brackets. In other words, when we need to group something that already has parentheses in it, we're going to use brackets. Okay? And now we can say it is not the case that if you score a 60 or 70, then you get an A. Okay? The brackets function just like parentheses. We use the brackets when there already are parentheses. So you might think of brackets as just a set of parentheses that go on top of something, or I should say around something, when there already are parentheses. So you might see something like this. Okay? If I wanted to say A or B implies C, in other words, if A or B is true, then C is true. If I wanted to say if all of this is the case, then E must be true, I need brackets. Okay? Another example. Let's say I wanted to say either A and B is the case, or this whole compound statement is the case. C and D or E is the case. Well, I need brackets to demonstrate what I'm trying to say, or to make clear what I'm trying to say, that either this is true or this is true. Okay, so now we have the tools to start dealing with some relatively complicated statements. Okay, let's do one example together, and then you're going to need to spend some time working on this, doing examples, getting comfortable. If I win the lottery, I'll quit my job, but if I get a raise, I'll buy a car and a TV. If I win the lottery, I'm quitting my job. But if I get a raise, I'll buy a car and a TV. Okay, how are we going to translate that? Well, if I win the lottery, I'll quit my job. Okay. But, in other words, and, if I get a raise, then I'll buy a car and a TV. Right? That's what we're trying to say here. If I get a raise, then I'll buy a car and a TV. Okay? But notice that this needs to be bracketed off to make sense out of this statement. Right? What we're trying to say here is that this is true and all of this is true. So this is basically an and statement, right? With an if-then on one side, okay, and an if-then on the other that happens to include two things in the then portion of the if-then statement. Okay, so you can see this is not a super complicated English statement, but there's a lot of logical relationships in there, and we need the tools to be able to get these things into symbolic logic. Again, why are we doing this? I realize it's complicated. Why are we doing this? Because once we have things in symbolic logic, we can go into the logical relationships that exist between statements and really understand how they work together. Okay, good luck.